The third installment of the Baker Center Energy and Environment Forum for the fall semester. I'm Charles Sims. I'm the director of the Energy and Environment Program here at the Baker Center for Public Policy. We are thrilled to be getting the E&E Forum back in the auditorium here. We have lots of people in the auditorium here. It's packed. There's mojitos in the back. We have lawn chairs out. It's great. So if you're online and you decided not to come, you're really missing out. Somebody just beeped me for saying that, I guess. If you've not joined us before, so the purpose of this seminar is a little different than many other seminars you might have been in. The purpose of this seminar is to try to bring together different disciplinary perspectives to environmental and energy issues and mesh them up and see what we get. So it's not your standard forum where it's going to be deep down technical. It's going to be more of a discussion on kind of high level issues, but bringing in as many perspectives as we can and bouncing them off of one another. As academics here at the university, we don't get a lot of chance to do that. We get lots of chances to talk to people who think like us about these issues, but this is the one chance, or one of the few chances we have on campus to talk about these issues with people that don't necessarily think like us. So if you are online, we will be doing a question and answer session at the end. You can hopefully see the link here where you can go and enter your questions in, and we'll be fielding those at the end. If you are online right now and you're not seeing PowerPoint presentations, at least on one of the pictures that you're looking at, you might want to figure out how to adjust your screen, because you should be able to see both a live feed into the auditorium and then a feed onto the PowerPoint presentations themselves. I know sometimes if you're looking at this on a device, on a phone, particularly, you may only get one visual, so you may have to toggle back and forth to get it over to the presentation mode so you can see the slides that we're talking about today. But pop those questions in while we're having the presentation, and then I'll get those at the end. Whoops. So to highlight, the final meeting of the forum is on November 18th. That will be with Megan Donahue. That is a virtual meeting, so they won't be in the auditorium. We'll be doing that one on Zoom as we were doing previously. She is from Hawaii, University of Hawaii, and the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. I don't have a title from her yet, but we know it will be related to likely marine ecology. But we'll get out an update on that title as soon as we can. If this is your first time and you're worried about missing out later, please send Elizabeth Woody an email, and she can add you to our listserv where you can get updates on this. I know at the end of this talk, you're going to think, that was amazing. I really don't want to miss another one of these talks. This is how you do it. Get on our mailing list, and we will send the updates to you on all the speakers that we have every semester. And if you also, for the same reason, want to get a recording, email Elizabeth as well, and she can send you a link to the recording as well. Okay? So with that, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Matt Burgess is an assistant professor of environmental studies, a fellow of the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and an affiliate faculty in the Department of Economics at the University of Colorado. Matt's my favorite type of academic. He's the type where you can't figure out where his PhD came from. So you read one of his papers and you think, clearly this guy has a PhD in ecology. You go and look and read another one of his papers and he's citing some obscure 1960s macroeconomist, and you're like, surely this guy has a degree in economics. And then you read another one of his papers and you think, surely this guy has a PhD in political science. So this is my favorite type of academic, kind of the perfect person for this forum. So join me now in welcoming Matt Burgess. folks, the folks that are in the auditorium, there really is treats out in the lobby. So if you didn't get any cookies or water, along with the mojitos, help yourself. Make sure you get snacks.
So you got to press the on button, apparently. So yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's really great. This is my first trip since the pandemic, which is super exciting. It's really nice to be in a room full of new people. And thank you, Charles, for having me and for the kind introduction and sort of describing the fact that I have a short attention span in a nice way. my lab's motto is, we're interested in anything that's interesting. And there's a lot of things that are interesting. Okay, so I want to talk about slowing economic growth and an area that I'm going to argue we're not paying enough attention to in the environmental space. A lot of this is based on this paper that's in press. It's in press at one of those journals that has an embargo policy. And so they said, tell us if you're going to present this paper before it comes out. And so I told them, and they said, you can say it's in press, you can have a preprint, which we do, you can find on my website, but you can't say where it's in press. So, sorry, but it's in press somewhere. And so what this is showing is the recent few centuries history of world GDP per capita growth, smoothed on a 21-year moving average. So you get rid of all the noise, or most of the noise. You can see the broad patterns. And so you can see there wasn't much per capita GDP growth before the Industrial Revolutions. Then it went up. Then there were the World Wars. We're going to talk about what the last two peaks are in a second. When you're doing a 21-year moving average, you're averaging the growth rates of the 10 years before, the focal year, and the 10 years after. You can't do that when you're in the last 10 years of your data. So to add on something like a visual of what the recent trend is, I fit a line through the growth rates of 2005 to 2021, where 2021 came from the April 2020 IMF projection of the recovery, which, as we now know, is quite optimistic. So that's what the red line is. And then the three dashed lines are the highest, medium, and lowest in terms of economic growth SSP scenarios, which are the scenarios that the IPCC uses in its most recent assessment report, where the first part of which just came out. I want to thank my collaborators. There's a bunch of papers that is related to with a bunch of smart people that I've worked on this with. So just want to acknowledge them. So quick outline. We're very focused, small topic today. We're going to look at a snapshot of economic growth and its social and environmental consequences. We're going to, in 10 minutes, go through the entire history of economic growth of the last 300 years. Just a little topic. And then we're going to talk about the future growth outlooks, which ones I think are more realistic than others and why, and what are some implications of that for both climate change and some of our societal problems that I argue we should be paying more attention to. Okay, so we've grown a lot. If you look at, by the way, if any of you are not familiar with the website Our World in Data, it's a fantastic website. It's exactly what it sounds like. They collect and make user-friendly data on just about anything you can imagine. Really, really good resource. So this is a plot from them on world GDP since 1820. It's gone up by about a factor of 100. So that's a pretty big increase. Now, obviously, there's some good parts to that. There's also some environmental impacts of that. So energy consumption has gone up by about 30 times, again, roughly. As you can see, unfortunately, most of it is still fossil energy, right? There's some nuclear at the top. There's some renewables at the top. The share of non-carbon sources of energy has been increasing, but it's still much less than half. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions, you're looking at about a 15 times increase. This is actually slightly out of date. The Global Carbon Project updated yesterday their estimates of historical carbon emissions, especially from land use. And now they say that we've been flat for about a decade. So that's modestly good news. But if you look at how quickly and how significantly our emissions have increased over this period of high economic growth, and you compare that to, one idea if we wanted to get to 0 by 2050 of how quickly we'd have to come back down, you're talking about a very stark challenge. And so motivated by that challenge and other areas in which we're having a big environmental impact related to how much we consume, there are various schools of thought that argue that we should stop, slow, or reverse growth on purpose. So 3 examples of relatively famous books in this genre. There's Georgios Kallis et al.'s The Case for Degrowth. There's Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, and Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth. Now, there's other people who disagree with that. So this is a recent book by Ben Friedman called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, where he says, don't forget about the good that's come from growth, not only in terms of our material well-being, but he argues that growth created a cooperative system where the economy was not zero-sum because we were growing, and where and he and others have argued that the cosmopolitanism that market economies necessitate creates the moral pretext for things like the rights revolutions and increases in empathy and declines in violence. And so, don't be down on growth too quickly, he says. You can also see the benefits of our historical growth in the data. So this is now global GDP per capita since 1820. It's gone up by about a factor of 10. Think about your income or your family's income or our national income. Mentally divide it by 10. Mentally multiply it by 10. These are big differences in your lives, probably. Related to Friedman's point, there have been a bunch of improvements in well-being that are at the very least strongly coincident with growth, and many would argue, at least in part, caused by growth, or affluence, or both. And if we talk about slowing growth, it really matters, actually, whether it's the affluence that's important or the growth that's important. So this is 6 examples, again, from our world in data. You can see the share of the population living in extreme poverty has fallen dramatically. This is going from, maybe hard to see the x-axis there, but it's going from 1820 to 2015. So the share, and apologies to the red-green, don't love the red-green thing on there, but basically the top share is the share that's not in extreme poverty. That's declined dramatically. Democracy, we all think, democracy is this old thing. There was Athens, right? There was Rome, sort of. But if you look at the fraction of the global population that lived in a democracy, it was almost 0 until the Industrial Revolutions. That's the top right. Basic education. What fraction of us have a basic education? That's gone up significantly. And this is globally, right? So it's unequal, but to some extent, most of these gains have been felt everywhere. Vaccinations. We didn't have a germ theory of medicine for most of the 1800s. Use folk remedies. Literacy's gone up. Child mortality's gone down. 40% in the 1800s, child mortality. As you'll see in a second, it was just under 18% in the late 1800s in the US. So 1 in 5 children didn't survive. These are big, big gains. There's a saying that money doesn't buy happiness. It turns out at a national and global level, that's not quite true, unfortunately. So and it depends a little bit on how you measure, but if you ask people how satisfied are you with your life, what each of these lines is showing is they've broken down countries by income quintiles. So you can kind of see, if you look at Togo at the very bottom, there's these little corners. Each corner represents a quintile of income. So the poorest 20%, the next 20%, et cetera. You ask on average, what's your income? And on average, what's your self-reported life satisfaction? And it's not a perfect correlation, right? There's lots of stuff that goes into happiness and satisfaction beyond income, but there's a very clear positive correlation across countries, right? If you look at the lines, they slope upwards, and within countries. the individual lines slope upwards for the most part too. Now, there's other measures where it's less of a strong correlation. So if you ask people their daily emotions, it's not as strongly correlated with income as if you ask them about their life satisfaction. There's a debate over whether and when the relationship saturates, but it definitely exists, at least at the level of these data. There's all kinds of other things that improve. So one is gender equality. This is the gender ratios for mean years of schooling in different regions. You can see that this is going up to 2010. They're slightly above 100% in rich regions today, but they've been going up everywhere. And if you look across countries, it's very strongly correlated with per capita GDP. More environmentalists should know this one. The deaths per million people from natural disasters have gone dramatically down in the last century. Now, that doesn't mean that climate change isn't happening, and it doesn't mean that climate change isn't making some kinds of natural disasters worse. Both of those things are happening. But it means that our ability to cope with it in terms of mortality has gotten better faster for now. And a lot of that has to do with things that are related to growth. Turns out that's also true for relative damages. So this is a plot looking at with different radii, so looking at the columns, 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, 400 kilometers from different kinds of damages, the different kinds of damages of the rows. In low, middle, and low income, high, middle, and high income, green, blue, respectively, and global average. What have been the damage in these radii from disasters as a percentage of exposed GDP? And all the lines slope down. So the fraction of what we have in the way of natural disasters that's being damaged has been declining. Again, that's not because certain disasters haven't been becoming stronger recently. They have. But think about, for a vivid illustration, think about Ida versus Katrina in New Orleans. The deaths in those two disasters were dramatically different. And Ida was only slightly weaker than Katrina, right? There was a lot of preparation and adaptation that was accomplished in that interim. And now, obviously, not all of that is directly related to GDP growth, right? And New Orleans isn't that much richer now than it was when Katrina happened. But some of it is. Other benefits: there's been a sharp decline of violence from a whole bunch of different measures over this period we've had growth. Many people link it to commerce and cosmopolitanism. Declines in child and elderly labor force participation. Retirement wasn't really a thing in the U.S. in the 1800s. Most people worked until they physically couldn't. And same thing, child labor correlates quite strongly with per capita GDP across countries, but also across time. We had a lot more child labor in the U.S. when we were poorer 200 years ago than we do now. Okay, so at CU, I teach a course on this issue, right? We basically have all those things I just talked about are the baby, and all the CO2 emissions and the environmental destruction is the bathwater. And how do you keep the baby and get rid of the bathwater, right? Unsustainable prosperity, we know how to do that. That's what we're doing now. Sustainable poverty, we know how to do that. That's what we did, 300 years ago. What we want to do is sustainable prosperity. And we want to think about, growth is so and affluence is so tied to these fundamental aspects of our societal well-being and our environmental problem that it's really central to thinking about the big environmental and social challenges that we face. And that's, really how I got interested in it. Okay, so let's now do a super brief history of why these graphs look the way they do. So the top graph is the one I showed at the beginning, where I'm showing the linear fit explicitly. The bottom graph is the same graph, but showing the OECD countries defined by the 1990 membership. So basically the richest countries. Talking about like Western Europe, Western offshoots, Japan. And you can see in the OECD, there's this single peaked, again, the world wars obviously brought it down, but there's this steady rise, and then there's been this steady decline. So to summarize this super briefly, there wasn't much GDP per capita growth before the 1800s. It's what we call Malthusian growth in economic history. Rapid growth in the 20th centuries in rich countries, peaking in about the 1960s. A similar peak in China in the 2000-2010 decade. If you look at the global trend, it goes up, it goes down with the world wars. The first peak is basically the OECD peak. The second peak is the China peak. So it's not like there was some calamity in between there, like the world wars. It was just that the rich countries peaked, and now today's middle income countries are peaking. And again, this is the high, showing the high, medium, and low SSP scenarios, which roughly maps onto the range of expert opinion also. And they all project somewhat declining growth in the 21st century, but to highly varying degrees. So for example, globally, if you look at the per capita GDP level by 2100, in SSP 5, the top one, or SSP 3, the bottom one, the difference is basically the integrals, right, of the two. And it's about a 6-fold difference. And that's a really big difference in, there's a pretty big uncertainty in what we're going to look like. Okay, so Malthusian growth. How many of you heard of Malthus? Yeah, most of you, right? So Malthus is most famous for this essay on the principle, I guess it was a book, but called it an essay on the principle of population, where he argued that increasing food production only temporarily improves well-being. Because people take that food production and they use it to reproduce more and have lower mortality rates, and eventually the population just grows to a point where there's not more affluence. We basically end up at the same per capita GDP level that we had before. We've just produced more people with that wealth, and so poverty is this unavoidable thing, and overpopulation is going to destroy the planet. So if you wanted to, you wanted to be an economist and translate that into an empirical prediction, your empirical prediction would be if land productivity goes up, population goes up, but per capita GDP doesn't go up. Now, Malthus is often spoken of kind of derisively in today's environmental context because we know that that's not true today. But actually, it was true approximately before the Industrial Revolutions. So this is data based on this really famous paper by Oded Galor, where they show it in 1500. They compare measures of land productivity and population density in different places, and you can see the positive correlation. And then if you compare land productivity to income per capita, there's no correlation, or it's a zero slope, which is exactly what Malthus's theory would predict. So Malthus, at the time that he was writing, was approximately right. The world just changed after that. So this is a figure from where it's adapted because I've drawn some lines on top of it. This is a figure from this textbook that I use in my class on economic growth by David Weil. And so what it's showing is across different time periods, average, this is in Western Europe, population growth rates and GDP per capita, or output per capita, which is closely related to GDP per capita growth rates, kind of in light blue and dark blue respectively. And again, the Malthusian growth prediction would be you have population growth but not affluence growth. And again, in the 500 to 1500 range, if you believe the data are obviously not great that far back, you basically see that Malthusian growth. But then something changes, right? So you have the demographic transitions. So initially, our medicine got better, our death rates went down, our population growth rates went up. You can see the population growth rates increasing, until the 1820 to 1870 time. Then as we became more affluent, our birth rates started to decline. That's the second demographic transition, and so our population growth rates went down, and our GDP or our output per capita growth rates went up, which is very un-Malthusian, right? Okay, so that's going from before the Industrial Revolution to the Industrial Revolution. Robert Gordon calls the period from 1870 to 1970, he's focusing on the US, but his argument applies broadly to today's rich countries. He calls it the special century. And what I really like about this book is that Robert Gordon is not just a good macroeconomist, he's also a good historian. And he really vividly describes what life was like in these different periods. And so to illustrate just how dramatically the U.S. society changed in this century, he gives these examples. So, he says in 1870 there were 40 million Americans. Life expectancy was 45. Think about that for a second. I'm 34. That'd be like 10 years left, right? 18% infant mortality rate. 18%, 1 in 5. Birth rates, 4.6 births per woman for white women and 7.7 for African American women. Again, think about, especially women in the audience, think about what that is like. Medicine, folk remedies. We didn't have a germ theory of medicine. We didn't understand what germs were. We didn't have sewers or water filtration. Cities smelled really, really bad. Imagine what New York or even Knoxville would smell like without sewers. We mostly traveled by horse-drawn carriage, so we had a horse for every 5 people in Boston. We made our clothes by hand, which consumed an incredible amount of time for mostly women in society. That then obviously prevented them from being able to participate in other aspects of the economy. We didn't have any mail or telegraph in the West. Most of us lived in the country. Our average consumption was $3,000 a year in 2010 prices. Imagine if your income was $3,000 a year. What could you do with it? We spent half of it on perishable goods. We didn't have fridges, so we mostly ate salted and smoked pork. We cooked with wood or coal, which, as we know now, had health effects. Right? You still see those in some developing countries. Only a fifth of women were in the workforce. Most jobs were farming or blue collar, and there were very few leisure activities for adults, except men sometimes got drunk. Okay, compare that to 1970. And again, this is 1970, so today it's kind of gone even further in this direction. Now there's 200 million Americans. Life expectancy is now 71. Infant mortality rate has gone down by a factor of 10, 2% instead of 20%. Birth rates now 2.5 for women, and there's no longer a significant racial difference. Near universal access to sanitation and electricity, especially in urban areas. We now have more cars than households. We mostly buy clothes from department stores or catalogs. We don't have to make them by hand. Mail service nearly universal. 50% of the population urban. I don't have it on here, but the birth control pill was invented, I believe, before this. GDP per capita is now $30,000 a year in 2010 prices. It's gone up by about a factor of 10. Almost everyone has a fridge. We mostly cook with gas and electric stoves, so we don't have to worry about the indoor coal and wood cooking. Mostly working in service and managerial occupations. Now about half of women are in the workforce. Obviously, that's even higher today. 95% of men, that's slightly lower today. Most households have radio and television. So this is a really, 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 really different world. And Gordon's point in making this comparison is that every sector of the society changed dramatically in this century. And so when you see the top of the curve in our per capita GDP growth rates, that's what that looked like, is basically his argument. Okay, and then in rich countries, our per capita GDP growth rate on average slowly declined. Again, I'm smoothing out the noise, so there's lots of bumping around, but there's been a slow decline after the special century. What's that about? So these are three books that look at this. One is The Great Stagnation from Tyler Cowen, which I believe was 2011. The Gordon book I just mentioned, 2016. And then recently, this book, Fully Grown by Dietrich Vollrath. And I recommend all of them. So this is my summary of this literature. Most economists agree that the reasons on the top have contributed to this. So aging populations, the older we are, the smaller our workforce is, on all else equals a share of our society. We also, fewer people on average have less aggregate demand and less aggregate supply. Shifts from goods to services. So a larger fraction of our economy now is service-based than it used to be. And that matters for growth because it's harder to grow productivity in service industries than in goods industries. And so to illustrate why that is, think about the following comparison. So there's Gordon, I believe, talks about a famous bomber factory in the 40s in the US that was making bombers for the war effort. That in the span of 5 or 6 months, more than doubled their output just by what economists call learning by doing, learning to be more efficient. Okay, so goods. Now, have any of you in the room ever waited tables? Okay, a few of you. Okay, so imagine waiting tables in the height of the dinner rush. Do you think over the course of 6 months you could train yourself to wait twice as many tables equally effectively during the peak dinner rush? Anyone? No, right? As Vollrath puts it, with goods, labor is an input to the product. With services, labor is the product. On top of that, if manufacturing industries become more productive, then, in a well-functioning economy, people should be paid their marginal product, right? Therefore, wages should go up. Well, if wages are going up in the manufacturing sector, then the service sector has to compete for workers with this high-wage manufacturing sector, and so their costs go up too. That's called Baumol's cost disease. That's another thing that makes service productivity go up. Now, why are we shifting from goods to services? And this is central to Vollrath's main point, is because we have the stuff that we need, right? Having one fridge is great. We don't need 10 fridges, right? Same thing with cars. And so that's a good thing. And aging populations. The main reason our birth rates have gone down is that we're richer. We've had big gains in women's rights. There's more equality in education in the workforce than we used to have. We invented the birth control pill. All those things are good. We wouldn't destroy our stuff or roll back those rights, I certainly hope, for the sake of increasing our per capita GDP growth. And so Vollrath says, yeah, we're declining, but it's for reasons that we wouldn't change. Other reasons are plateauing educational attainment. So, the rate at which our educational attainment is increasing is slowing, and the effect that has on productivity is also slowing, right? It makes a big difference to go from nobody has any education to everybody has a secondary education. It probably makes less of a difference, and you wouldn't even have or want this to go from everyone has a secondary education to everyone has a PhD. There's lots of professions where you don't need a PhD. Why would you waste the time doing it? And then there are other things like urbanization is a one-way trip. Urbanization increases growth, but you can't have more than everybody in the cities. Same thing, female workforce participation, all else equal, increases growth, but you can't have more than 100% of women in the workforce. And so these things are plateauing. In fact, the workforce participation rate overall is declining. Reasons being debated. So Gordon argues that if you look at how dramatically our society changed all at once, that's just not likely to ever happen again. And he in his argument that there's no evidence yet that the tech revolution has done anything close to what the special century did. There are other people who disagree with him and say, look, there's a bunch of secondary inventions that we need to have and improvements in human capital, and eventually we'll catch up to our inventions and so the productivity growth boom from tech we just haven't seen yet. That's Eric Brynjolfsson, for example, argues that. So that's being debated. And then there are context-dependent reasons, right? So there's a lot of economists who argue that inequality is a drag on growth in the US because on the demand side, richer people save a larger fraction of their income. So if you have more income concentrated among the rich, you have lower aggregate demand. And on the supply side, if your education system is so unequal that you're not training your human capital in certain segments of society, then that's a drag on your supply side. But obviously, it's not that all inequality is always bad for growth. It just is context dependent. And same thing with debt. Logically has to be such a thing as too much debt. There's a debate about where that line is and if the U.S. and other countries are over that line or not. Really interesting. So Baumol, the same Baumol that Baumol's cost disease is named after, noticed in this paper from 1986 that if you plot the 1950 GDP per capita on the x-axis against the 1950 to 1980 average growth rate, it looks like this hump-shaped thing. Kuznets function is what fits this. In $1970, it has a peak of about $1,000. Is sort of when your per capita GDP growth starts declining. Okay, David Tillman was one of my PhD advisors. He's actually an ecologist. This is a figure that's buried in the supplement of one of his famous papers on food agricultural intensification versus extensification. If any of you are familiar with that debate. So I got interested in this because as those of you who have seen my paper that I gather was sent around on the IPCC scenarios, they have been over-projecting growth largely because their historical projections have been based on the IMF, and the IMF has been over-projecting growth. And so right after that paper came out, Tillman published a new, not this one, but a new one that uses the same growth model in Science, saying food alone is going to stop us from hitting the 1.5 degree target. And I said, aha, I bet he's using a biased growth model because he's an ecologist. He probably just pulled it from the IMF or something, or one of the SSPs. Turns out he makes his own that's based on this, where he fits a Kuznets function into these economically binned, like he groups countries in these economic bins that he numbers A from richest to G, the poorest. And as far as, and this is preliminary, so I might walk it back in a few months, but as far as my postdoc Ryan Langendorf and I can tell, Tillman's simple differential equation model, that relationship specifies a differential equation, at the level of large aggregations is more accurate and precise than the IMF, which is wild. Okay, so besides the fact, and the other really important point about this is that as you become richer, past a certain point, your growth declines, growth rate declines, just like Baumol noticed. So it's still true. So for these reasons, and for this reason, and for this reason, you might expect growth to decline over time in rich countries. In fact, we've seen that, right? What are some other reasons that I think suggest a slower outlook? One is that economic growth forecasts have tended to be biased high. This is the IMF is an example of this, but also Frankel at, I think is at Harvard Kennedy School, has shown that national governments are biased high too, on average. So this is plotting this in the IPCC regions, where the darker blue lines are forecasts that were made 5 years ahead and kind of on down. So darker blue is further ahead. 5 years ahead is the darkest blue. The purple is the SSP2, which is the middle of the road. But before 2018, all the SSPs are basically the same. The light gray is the data, and then the forecast that was made right before COVID, up to 2024 by the IMF. Don't worry about the red and black. That has to do with mean and median. But okay, the 2 points I want to make here are the forecasts have been biased high, yes, but it's not just the Great Recession, right? Some people might see that plot where I plot, 2005 to 2021 and be like, all right, Burgess, you got the Great Recession and you got the COVID recession, and you're telling me that growth is slower than the scenarios. Whoop-de-doo, right? This is before COVID. All these data come before COVID, so COVID's not a factor in this. Same thing actually with the paper we included COVID after the fact. And you can see the errors are the biggest in poor countries, right? The Great Recession explains most of the error in the OECD, but not in the Middle East and Africa, right? Not in Latin America and the Caribbean. Part of that is major events like the Syrian civil war, which obviously had a huge effect on growth, Venezuelan collapse. So we're especially bad at forecasting growth in poor countries. There are a bunch of reasons for it that I don't have time to get into. One of them, unfortunately, is that we really, really, really want convergence to happen. That's in all of our development goals. And so when we make these long-term projections, we assume that we're going to hit our development goals or something like it. But that doesn't make it true. Now, this line slopes down. We are converging somewhat. It's not, inequality globally is decreasing across countries, but maybe not as fast as we hoped. So if that continues to be true, if we continue to overestimate project growth, then that would suggest we should revise our outlook. But if we've been routinely biased high and the scenarios say this is what you should expect, rationally we should say, they're probably going to be biased high if past is future. Okay, second reason is population projections are being revised down. So I believe the most recent UN projection is from 2019. That's the dashed purple line, UN medium. There was a bunch of demographers in the Lancet about a year ago that published a paper saying actually it might be quite a lot slower. This is their medium, their reference scenario. And then the SSPs are in there for comparison. Why has it been revised down? Well, basically the UN has historically assumed that demographic transitions in today's poor countries will progress at similar rates as they did in today's rich countries when they were poorer and had similar birth rates. But actually, the newer data is suggesting that urbanization and women's education, thankfully, are progressing much faster in today's poor countries than they progressed in rich countries when we were poor. And so if that portends a lower birth rate, as it has here, then that revises these population projections down, and all else equal, that means less growth, economic growth. It also has some fascinating geopolitical implications, like China might lose half of its population this century just through aging, right? That's wild. Think about what that would mean for geopolitics. Other things that might suggest a slower growth outlook. Long-run effects of COVID-19. Some people think that there might be long-lasting effects on certain cohorts that are affected in the education system. I really hope that's not true. The jury's still out as far as I know in terms of the literature. But also on trade. That one's much more believable that we're going to retreat a little bit from globalization as we get more cautious about travel, as we get more cautious about, well, maybe we shouldn't have all of our important heavy metals come from one place, and then we try to make more domestic supply chains. Interestingly, the slowest growth SSP scenario, the defining feature, it's called regional rivalry. The defining feature is a retreat from globalization. And then last thing is climate change and cost of mitigating. As far as I know, the SSPs don't directly account for damage, and that's important because you wouldn't want to have a model that assumes damage that you then use to project damage, right? But all else equal, that would suggest a downward revision. And maybe more debate on this, but there's certainly some economists who think that the cost of dealing with climate change in the short term might be a drag on growth, depending on how expensive it is. Okay, so in just about 40 minutes, we've gone through the macro implications of growth, a brief history of growth. Now we're going to talk about really quickly what is this pattern of slowing growth and possibly an outlook that's on the low end of what experts project. What does that mean for climate change? What does that mean for society? In broad terms. So just to orient you in terms of climate change, this on the left is a figure from the most recent IPCC assessment report, the Working Group 1 that just came out a month ago, 2 months ago. What month is it? Anyway, recently. And these are the marker scenarios that they use. So SSP 5 8.5, that's the new version of what we used to be called RCP 8.5, gives you about 4.5 degrees warming. And sorry, so the SSP, the number after SSP is the SSP scenario. The number after the dash is the watts per meter squared forcing in 2100. So SSP 5, RCP 8.5 is kind of what SSP 5 8.5 stands for. SSP 3 7, SSP 2 4.5, 1 2.6, 1 1.9. And so the 1 2.6 is approximately the 2 degree scenario. 1.9 is approximately the 1.5 degree scenario. 4.5 I think is about a little over 2.5. 3 7 is something like high threes I think, and 8.5 is 4 to 5. And then this is the orienting, this is a figure from O'Neill et al. Orienting the SSPs in terms of what they call low challenges to adaptation versus high, and same thing for mitigation. And broadly, low challenges to mitigation means that it's easier. We decarbonize faster, all else equal. Low challenges to adaptation means we have faster growth. So SSP1 and SSP5 have the most economic growth. SSP3 and 4 have the least. 2 is in the middle. And SSP3-7 is what you get when you turn off carbon policy and you go all in on coal with SSP3 growth. So at least in the marker, that's as hot as you can get. SSP5 8.5 is you turn off climate policy, you go all in on coal, and you have really, really high growth. And so what does this slow growth mean? I argue that it means the high emission scenarios are very unlikely. So for example, if you look at recent economic history, we're maybe looking at SSP3, maybe slightly lower. If you take the Tillman model and project it out, this is a paper that I'm writing with my postdoc right now, you get an outlook between SSP3 and SSP4. That's the bottom left. Population, if you take Volsat's reference scenario at face value, you're looking at about SSP2. But beyond that, there's just some stark contradictions in the high emission scenario. So in the top, this is showing primary coal use per capita. So how much coal we're using per person. It's been basically flat for 100 years. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, in their 2020 stated policies, somewhat like business as usual, said it's going to go down a little bit. Their 2021 revision, which I haven't added into this graph yet, goes down slightly faster. SSP3 says, 3.7 says it increases sharply. SSP5 8.5 says it goes up by a factor of 6. That's very different from what the IEA says. On top of that, there's an even more fundamental contradiction. So this is now breaking out by these regions, per capita GDP projections in SSP5 8.5 in the dark red and 3.7 in the light red. SSP5 8.5 says everybody has over $100,000 per capita GDP, all regions by 2100 in 2011 dollars. So basically, the average person in sub-Saharan Africa is a Google employee today. And they have to be that rich to demand enough coal, even going all in on coal to meet their energy demand for the world to get that hot. But then there's other studies, like this Mora et al. Study, that say, if we really got that hot, then all the areas in red in the tropics have unlivable heat over 300 days a year. Meaning the wet bulb temperature is so high that you can't cool your body by sweating. And so if you stand outside for long enough, you die. Are we really going to be that hot and that rich at the same time and still want to go all in on coal? That doesn't make any sense to me. And so if you're tempted to take RCP 8.5 and call it business as usual, I would argue you should not. If you see a headline that calls RCP 8.5 business as usual, I would take it with a grain of salt. Now, none of this means we shouldn't worry, right? If we can't get that hot because we can't get that rich because we get damaged before that, that's not good. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't do something about climate change, but it does mean we should stop using that scenario probably, at least for as business as usual. There's exploratory, there's good reasons to use that scenario, but not as business as usual. So this is a paper that we have that's R&R right now, led by my colleague at CU, Roger Pilkey. What we do is we take all of the scenarios in the various integrated assessment model database and say which ones have growth rates that are in emissions that are most consistent with the data from 2005 to 2020, and then the IEA's stated policies projection out to 2040. If you do that, the median of those gets you to about 2.2 degrees warming by 2100, about SSP 3.4. You can say, okay, there's a lot of carbon capture in the second half of the century in these scenarios. So if you just look at fossil fuel emissions, which gets rid of industry, and that's where they put the carbon capture, then you get about SSP 4.5. That's the dashed purple line. Remember how I showed that the population might look like SSP2, the growth might look like SSP3. Just for fun, I took SSP3 4.5 and knocked the population down to SSP2 population, basically right on top of the median scenario that's consistent with the IEA and the data. Again, about 2.2 degrees of warming. If you assume that emissions are constant out to 2019, you get about 3 degrees of warming. Now, 3 degrees of warming is not a good world, but it's not 4 or 5 degrees of warming. So the RCP 8.5, I would argue, is not business as usual. And more recent, there's a bunch of other analyses from other groups that have now also come out that have somewhat broadly similar conclusions to us. So this is Climate Action Tracker. They say that current policies get us 2.7 to 3.1 degrees. Pledges get us about 2.4. Optimistic net zero gets us to 2. And we got more work to do to get under 2. So that's what I think all this means in terms of what a likely climate future is. Or plausible, as my colleague Cookie would say. Okay, what does it mean for society? So we looked at in this paper, this isn't from our paper, this is from Bloomberg, but in our paper that's in press at a mysterious journal I can't name, we looked at fiscal implications and social implications of slowing growth for developed democracies. And so one of the interesting fiscal implications, but this also a little bit nuanced, is about debt, right? If we're going to slow down growth, how much debt can we afford? And the reason why we were thinking about this is, GDP is the denominator of debt over GDP, which is often how we measure the debt burden. If you look at on the red line on the top is the federal debt held by the public in the U.S. as a percentage of GDP, and you can see it's gone up and down and up, right? There have been times when we've brought it down significantly. But we have not brought it down by paying our debt off, right? The bottom line is showing the deficit. If it's above the line, we're running a deficit. If it's below the line, we're running a surplus as a percentage of GDP. And we've almost never run a surplus. A little bit in the Clinton years, a little bit in the 40s and 50s after the Second World War, but mostly not. The vast majority of our reductions in debt to GDP historically have been through growth. And so, not surprisingly, as our growth slows down, the projections of what our debt to GDP is going to be go up. If you look at one of the things we do in this paper is say, okay, what are examples of developed democracies that have already faced multiple decades of stagnation? Two that come to mind are Japan and Italy. And they're interesting to compare because they're quite different from each other culturally and geographically. In both of those, they've ended up with debt to GDP higher than 100%. Japan's higher than 200%, or at least they were when these data came out. And you can see for the US, on the bottom, we're plotting the successive revisions to the Congressional Budget Office's forecast of debt to GDP. Lighter purple to darker purple is kind of going from earlier to more recent. We've been revising the debt projections up. We've been revising the growth projections on the right down. Again, lighter to darker is earlier to more recent. Okay, so if you had a literally zero growth world, then in order to, other than inflation, basically paying your debt down would be the only way to lower your debt to GDP ratio. So how much debt can we afford to slow growth? You might think, okay, we really got to tighten our belts, right? But actually, it's not so obvious that that's true. So this is a figure from Olivier Blanchard, who at the time was the president of the American Economic Association, and he says, look, the burden of $1 borrowed today over time goes down as long as the nominal growth rate, so roughly GDP growth plus inflation, is bigger than the interest rate on government debt. And he says, look, that's almost always been true. So even as our growth rate's gone down, our government interest rate on debt has gone down, commensurately, sometimes even more. And so the burden of the $1 borrowed today is still going down as long as that inequality holds. And this is from our paper for U.S., Japan, and Italy, but it's based on an analysis by Jason Furman and Larry Summers, where they take it even further and say, hey, maybe debt to GDP isn't even the right measure for debt burden. Maybe what we really care about is we don't want the interest burden to be unsustainable, so we care about government interest as a percentage of GDP. That's what we're showing on the left. And we care about inflation. We don't want to overheat the economy with stimulus and trigger inflation. And so we show it for these three countries that we focus on in our paper. He shows it for all of the G7. Both of these measures have declined across these countries. So our interest rates, our government interest rates have gone down, and so our interest payments as a percentage of GDP, even though our debt to GDP has gone up, those have gone down. And we're not having massive inflation either. The inflation in the consumer price index has also gone down. And so maybe what they conclude from this is maybe at least in the short term, especially in light of some of the spending needs we have on things like infrastructure and climate change, maybe there is fiscal space, as they say, to take on more debt. But how much, we don't know. Another thing that's worth considering, though, in the context of economic growth forecasts tending to be biased high and being revised down, is should we be mentally revising our debt projections up, anticipating for that? And if you look historically, our projection errors, looking backwards in GDP or GNP, the CBO changed what they were projecting in the 90s, I think, and our revenue projection errors are super strongly correlated, and our deficit projection errors are also correlated, which makes sense, right? If the government thinks it's going to have more GDP than it actually does, it's going to underestimate how much revenue it's going to get and underestimate its revenue and underestimate how much it's going to have to spend on safety net programs. So public finance. Debt, definitely stuff happens with debt as growth slows down. What and how soon? In how much debt belt tightening it might require and how soon, we don't really know, but we should think about it. The other thing is with personal finance, right? So if economic growth slows, Thomas Piketty famously showed that, well, he predicted that inequality would go up. Later, critics of his showed that really what's important is the capital stock growth has to also eventually slow. Otherwise, the capital share of income explodes and rich people own most of the capital. So inequality explodes. And so if that's true, if growth is slowing, we need to slow the growth of the capital stock. Piketty's critics argue that's going to happen automatically, just through economic forces. We need to rethink exponential growth-based savings mechanisms. So we can't always assume house prices are going up if our economy is not growing. We can't always assume that we can make modest contributions and save for retirement and education that way through exponential growth of those modest contributions. Doesn't mean there's no other models to save for these things. We just have to think about them. We can't take for granted the models that we have. And actually in Japan and a lot of places, house prices are already going down as their population is shrinking and their economy is stagnant. Okay. Running a little short on time, but let's just quickly talk about possible social challenges. So one is, if Piketty's right, you might worry about inequality. Another way to think of it that's less mechanical as Piketty is, if our economy becomes more zero-sum, then that means making somebody richer has to make someone else poorer. Which segments of society are going to be better at playing that game, do you think? The rich or the poor? Right? Also, are we going to have less social trust because it's harder to come up with a system that makes everybody richer if we're growing slower? Lack of opportunity for youth, I'll talk about in a second. Challenges to family formation, birth rates and marriage rates have gone down. Mental health. So for example, the onset of Japan's period of stagnation coincides with a sharp increase in the suicide rate of men. There's some smaller but also notable increase in the male suicide rate following the Great Recession. Interestingly, you don't see that in Italy. We speculated a little bit in the paper on why that is. One reason I suspect is that there's a culture, in contrast to Japan and the US, there's more of a culture of older people and unattached youth living with relatives. And so that decreases the social isolation for those two groups, which are the two most vulnerable groups for suicide. Oops. Okay, and to address these things, we call for a guided civic revival. I'm going to talk about a little bit of what that means in a couple of areas. We say it a civic revival because we think it has to include grassroots or cultural forces. We say it's guided because governments need to play a role too. Very excited to share this paper from a mysterious journal with you soon. I want to focus on two areas really quickly, and I think there should still be time for questions. So one is this combination of lack of opportunity for youth and gaps between expectation and reality. So if growth slows, and it's not just about growth slowing, it's about growth slowing faster than we think it's going to slow, which again is historically what's happening. If that happens, then on average, people might grow their retirement savings slower than they were expecting, and so they might delay retirement. We already have a situation that's not related to slow growth, but housing is not affordable in a lot of big cities. Both of these things are not good for the economic situation of our young people. Now, eventually, aging populations can create labor shortages, they can lower housing prices, some of these things can be offset. But gaps between expectation and reality fuel political unrest. And interestingly, I don't think that many people outside of certain niche areas of sociology know this, but it's especially among upper middle class youth where you tend to see this unrest. So this is a figure, another aspect of this gaps between expectation and reality story. This is a figure from Raj Chetty et al. Where he says, the percentage of children earning more than their parents was, over 90% in 1940, and has steadily declined. It's just about 50%, in 1990. He calls this the fading American dream. Well, if we had a zero growth world, 50% would be what you would expect, right? But this declining trend does create a gap between expectations and reality. If you're used to your parents being richer than your grandparents and so on, and you think you're going to be richer than your parents and you're not, that creates unrest, especially again among upper middle class youth. Interestingly, that is exactly what we see in U.S. polarization, even though I don't think a lot of people realize this, right? So there's this story that you sometimes hear that polarization in the U.S. is super racial, right? There's white people on the right and there's non-white people on the left, and old and young. The old and young part is roughly true. The white non-white thing is not true. The two extremes are the whitest of the political groups in the U.S. They're also the richest, and they're more so the left than the right. They're the most educated, and you can see this. If this seems counterintuitive to you, think about recent primaries. Joe Biden won the primary mostly on the backs of the poor and non-white vote. Eric Adams won the primary in New York, again disproportionately on poor and non-white vote. AOC, interestingly, beat Crawley mostly on the rich white vote. Not a lot of people know that one. And so that is a feature of our polarization. So colleges, if you want to cater better to your diversity, the answer is not to go extreme, I would argue. I would argue that's a symptom of our lack of diversity, to the extent that we are going extreme. How do you increase economic opportunity for youth to offset these things? Build more housing density in places with high costs. Yes, in my backyard, right? Improve public K-12 education and reduce higher ed costs. By the way, that's good for growth and reducing inequality too. And better tailor education to job skills. And these are recommendations that are not rocket science. We're basically pulling these from the literature. Our main point of our paper is we got to pay attention to this stuff. Okay, the last thing I want to mention, and sorry I'm going a little bit over time, is the interaction between inequality and social trust, and how we need to address both of those things together. So inequality is not good for trust in a couple of different ways. So this is just data showing, I've blown up the axis titles because they're probably hard to read. This is looking across countries. More unequal countries have less trust in others. Inequality violates people's visceral sense of fairness. It also creates segregation, right? If we're super unequal in inequality, probably rich and poor people are not living in the same places. They're leading super different lives, which makes it harder to relate to each other. They're not going to the same schools. And segregation in general makes trust lower between groups, right? So geographic segregation by income is bad for income polarization. Racial segregation is bad for racial polarization. There's political segregation, so there's much more opposition to cross-party marriage in the U.S. than cross-racial marriage now. And there's so little cross-party marriage that Amy Chua, who's a Yale law professor, says that the political parties in the U.S. are almost becoming ethnic groups because there's so little intermarriage between them. And slow growth could add stress to the social fabric because it makes our economy more zero-sum. And so what do you do about it? We say we need to reduce inequality, we need to socially integrate diverse populations, and we need to build shared identities. And we argue that there could be a virtuous cycle between those because each one is kind of good for the other. If you look at, remember Piketty's prediction, as we slow growth, our inequality is going to go up. That's approximately true in the English-speaking world among rich countries. It is not true in the non-English-speaking world. Inequality was really high in the 20s. In both places, it comes down. In the English-speaking world, it goes back up. In the non-English-speaking world, it doesn't. Why is that? Well, approximately, it has to do with policies. On average, it's not a hugely impressive correlation, but Gini is not an amazing measure of inequality either. But on average, there's bigger governments, more redistributive governments in non-English-speaking rich countries. There's also, on average, more labor, more progressive labor policies. So that's the proximate cause. One of the critiques of the idea of we need to go back to an age of strong labor protections is that, well, the time when we had really strong labor protections and really low inequality corresponds time-wise pretty closely with a historic low in globalization. So trade, financial integration, migration, all bottomed out just before we had this big low in inequality and this big high in labor rights. And so might that be, which is the chicken and which is the egg? Right? Did we get rid of labor policies, because competitiveness forced us to? That's kind of one story. The other thing that we need to figure out in countries like here in Canada, where I come from, is how to build cultural solidarity within our rich diversity. Right? Our diversity is economically is a huge strength. Culturally, it's a huge strength. But there's some unsettling evidence that cultural solidarity between rich and poor increases political support for redistribution. So are countries like Denmark more equal because they're nation states and the rich are more likely to support redistribution for that reason? This is a plot from Putnam, who's a Harvard sociologist, showing unfortunately a strong positive correlation between ethnic homogeneity in U.S. neighborhoods and trust. And then Heather McGee, in a recent book, argues persuasively that in the U.S., racism drove a decline in support for safety net spending following the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So we have to solve this problem. We might have to be more united in order to have redistribution be more politically possible. Not to evangelize my homeland, but there's a nice counterexample in Canada. So there was a study by Stoll and Harrell that looked at the relationship between diversity and trust in Canada, and they found among older Canadians, the Putnam relationship was there. So people who had more diverse social circles had less trust. But among young people, there was a weak opposite relationship. Young people who had more diverse social networks had more trust. And their rationalization, which resonates strongly with me as a young Canadian who grew up in a big city and has a racially blended family, is that we had this big wave of immigration in my parents' generation, and there were vast cultural differences, obviously, between people with different backgrounds. But the kids grew up together in cities like Toronto, which now has no majority and has people born in every single country except two, a recent art project found. They couldn't find two countries. They're both like really small island countries. And so we have now, younger Canadians, adopted this multicultural shared identity where we grew up together and can relate to each other, and our identity of what it means to be a Canadian is this rich, diverse thing. I don't have a figure on it, but there's some evidence of a similar dynamic in California, where they also had a big wave of immigration in roughly my parents' generation. They had a lot of tensions around that in the 90s, and now they have a majority-minority state that's, on these types of issues, one of the most progressive in the country. So integration reduces intergroup conflict. There's lots of evidence for that. If you have contact between groups and settings with equal status, cooperation towards shared goals, that reduces prejudice and builds solidarity. One example I really like is people who had roommates of a different race in college were found to have less racial prejudice later in life. It turns out integration is also good for reducing inequality. So there's this famous experiment in economics called the moving to opportunity experiment, where they gave poor families housing vouchers. So instead of creating these concentrated neighborhoods of poverty, they said, here's some money, go live wherever you want. And they found that the kids of the families that were given that had higher earnings, higher college attendance rates, fewer single-parent families. And I bet their being in neighborhoods of richer people created more tolerance among those richer people, more inclusivity. I don't think Chetty specifically speaks to that, but I highly suspect that's the case. So integration is important. There's also some arguments that I find convincing that that's not quite enough. So Trudeau, for example, in Canada, which I disagree with, says, our identity is we don't have one. That doesn't really work. If you want to have the social solidarity you need to support costly redistribution programs, you have to have some kind of shared purpose. Or costly, building infrastructure, build back better, right? We have to have a reason to believe that we want to do that together. And that's you have to walk a little bit of a fine line, because you need to have a shared identity to have that solidarity. But there's some evidence that if you go too far and say, okay, we're going to have a shared identity, but that really means we need all the same culture, there's some studies, for example, this one by Richardson and Nussbaum, that found that actually can increase prejudice against minorities. So we don't want that. And so I don't know the perfect answer, but the best answer I've seen that Richardson and Nussbaum talk about, and also Amy Chua talks about, is this idea of we can have a layered identity, and countries like the US and Canada are uniquely suited to that because we are, nations of immigrants, right? And so the idea is we identify strongly as Americans, but we're also allowed to retain subgroup identities that can be part of our personal identity and add richness to our society, but we have to strongly identify as Americans. We can't divide ourselves. And so the question we pose in this paper is, can we start a virtuous cycle, right? If integration reduces inequality and builds solidarity, and less inequality and more solidarity creates more political will for redistribution, that's a good snowball that we like. Now, it can also go the other way, right? And so I would caution, against, sometimes it can be important to be divisive, to draw attention to an issue, but you want to make sure that you're not accidentally decreasing the social conditions for reducing inequality. Other objectives, which I don't have time to get into, we argue we should increase return on investment in taxation and public spending to, solve the debt problem as best as we can, if that's going to get harder. We need to strengthen formal democratic institutions. Basically, slow growth is probably going to stress test our democratic institutions, and so let's make them as strong as we can. I would argue that the January 6th was such a pathetic revolution attempt that we passed that stress test. Apologies to anyone who doesn't like that online. We should improve non-economic drivers of subjective well-being, and these are all no-regrets objectives. So we think these are more important if growth slows, but they're good if growth doesn't slow. They're just good things to do. Sorry I went a little over time. Thanks. These are our public related papers and working papers. Again, this one I can't say what journal it's coming out in, but the preprint is available on my website. And I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Matt. So folks in the room, we have a microphone here for any questions. We also, folks in online, we have some in line that I'll field as well. I'm going to take the first one. So Matt.
Yeah.
I would assume most of the pushback you're getting is that you seem to be saying that the worst case scenarios are not as bad as we think, and so that this is giving some fuel to the fire for the skeptics, right? That's most of what people are taking away from.
In terms of the climate, so interestingly, there was another paper by insiders that argued that the BAU was wrong, and so they took some heat. And then a couple of my colleagues wrote a more pointed paper about the scientific integrity implications of how the scenarios have been used. And so far, they've taken all the heat, and I've gotten almost none.
Okay.
But certainly that would be something you would be concerned about. And my response to that, when we did discuss that in my lab before we published this paper, and my response to that is twofold. These issues with the scenarios are so obvious that if I don't point it out, someone else is going to. And obviously, 2 other groups did, right? So what's worse for the trust of climate science? If I publish this, or if someone else finds out that I discovered it and buried it? That's number one. Number two, might deniers misuse this? Sure. And in fact, some of you might remember there were some quite odd climate pamphlets that the Trump administration published right between the election and when they left office. And one of those did cite our paper. Now, did that citation make people who who thought those pamphlets were zany think they were not zany? Oh, they cited Burgess, so yeah, climate's not happening, even though that's not what we say. So I'm not so worried about that, moving anybody really being convinced. But also, most importantly, if the Trump administration calls me to testify about climate change, that's great, right? Because I'll tell them that it's real, it's us, and we should do something about it. They don't call me, who are they going to call? What are they going to say? So that's my answer to your question. But also, I think it's just a dangerous game for science. There's a lot of talk in some circles of academia about how scientists have this trusted position in society. We should use that position to push our political agenda. And I think that has the causality of our trusted position backwards. We have our trusted position if and only if we are honest brokers of the facts. And the second that's not the case, we lose that position. And in fact, if you look at what fraction of Americans think universities are good for society, in about 2015, that falls off a cliff for Republicans and independents. In Virginia, 2 days ago, a Republican ran in a state that's given the Democrats every presidential election since 2008, gave Biden last year a 10-point victory. He basically ran a single-issue campaign. There are bad ideas coming from here, academia, getting out into our schools. I don't think it's, you completely characterize it right. I think there's definitely some dog whistles in there. But he won over voters of every demographic and suburban voters of every race. So there's something we're doing that's not Americans don't like.
So I know the answer because you told us it was your first gig out on the circuit post-pandemic. But there's challenges in here for a US audience. There would be challenges in here for a European audience. But I wonder what would happen if you gave this talk in China. I suspect some of the lessons that you're talking about might actually be much more problematic for countries that are at a different point on that Kuznets curve.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I would definitely tailor it more to a Chinese audience if I was giving it in China. So in the paper, we focus on developed democracies for 2 reasons. One, if we're all on the Kuznets curve, we're going to get to the bottom of it first. if the people that say we should stop growth on purpose are right, they say we should do it first because we can afford to. And also, unfortunately, the literature is most well developed on these issues in rich countries. That's unfortunately a gap in most, if not all, of academia. But you're totally right. The things like strengthening democratic institutions are obviously very specific to democracies. But things like slow growth making society more zero-sum, gaps between expectations and reality creating unrest, the fiscal problems, those apply everywhere. And China in particular, I mean, they've got some, they might lose half their population this century. That's not us, right? We take in immigrants, right? And that stops us from having that kind of demographic crisis that might affect our economy. Speaking of expectation and reality, their government is so used to this massive growth that they fueled this big, some people call it financial crisis, some people call it construction crisis. So as I understand it, in China, you don't pay for housing with debt. You pay for it up front before it's built, and then the construction company owes you a house. So they have something like a housing bubble where basically there's a bunch of construction companies that owe people houses that aren't built yet, and they didn't run out of money. But I don't think we really, or at least I don't, from what I've read, really understand what it looks like when that bubble bursts. But that's certainly an example. So these problems apply everywhere. And then the other thing that's interesting is, that Kuznets curve slopes down, global geopolitical equality decreases. That it's broadly a good thing, but maybe also it creates an instability that we haven't seen in a long time. At least since the Cold War. We're already seeing that a little bit with the U.S. and China.
So Matt, we've got a lot of questions online. So
yeah,
and by all means, folks, keep sending them in online. But one that keeps showing up time and time again, and I'll just take one question here and read it off. Given that we're already experiencing economic repercussions from global climatic shifts due to carbon emissions, why does it really matter if the highest emission scenarios are unlikely?
Well, it matters. I think the spirit of the question, and I guess the questioner can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, I can't see the chat, but I think the spirit of the question is, if the highest emissions scenarios are unlikely, does that mean there's no problem, we shouldn't do anything? No, it doesn't mean that. There's a problem, we should do something, right? The planet keeps warming until we get to zero. In fact, we might not get to 4 to 5 degrees by 2100, but even if we're on, SSP 4.5, eventually we'll get to 4 and 5 degrees if we don't get emissions to zero, right? So there's definitely a problem. Now, so why point it out? A couple of reasons. One is we need good projections for the climate that we're going to see. So economic damages from climate change are already super uncertain. A lot of them that have been published, certainly the ones that make headlines, are based on RCP 8.5. So, what do we make of that? But also for other kinds of research, right? So the website Our World in Data wrote recently that we're trying to put together projections of what's going to happen to coral reefs this century because of climate change. And we can't do that because every single global coral reef paper is based on RCP 8.5. So that's not good. SSP 3.2, 3.4, which is where our most plausible scenarios are headed, wasn't even run in CMIP 6 in the climate models because it wasn't prioritized. That doesn't make sense. Maybe the most likely or second most likely, if you think 4.5 is more likely scenario, we don't even run it. Right? So we're wasting a lot of computing time on this scenario. And my colleague Pilkey and us in this other paper, we show that if you look at the literature, we looked at it in ecology and fisheries, he looked at it in climate more broadly, RCP 8.5 is the single most mentioned scenario. And in fisheries and ecology, it's not close. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. There's certainly some areas where let's crank the temperature all the way up and see when we get crazy tipping points, right? We definitely should do that kind of research. You want to have really hot scenarios to do that research, right? So it's not that we shouldn't throw RCP 8.5 in the dustbin, But we definitely shouldn't be devoting 60% of our research to that scenario. It's a long answer to a simple question.
Any other quick questions? Great. I think we're going to let Matt off the hook. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Grab a snack on the way out and join me one more time in thanking Matt Burgess.
Thanks, everybody.